While the US and Russia are negotiating peace, Germany and all of Europe are resorting to more armed force to enforce their vision of justice. But Europe has neither the weapons nor the economic strength to even begin to accomplish that. What is going on with Germany and Europe? To better understand the continent's geopolitical situation, I have Dr. Gabriele Krone-Schmalz with me today, the author of many nonfiction books, including Respekt Works Differently, Reflections on Our Divided Country, and Ice Age, How Russia is Demonized and Why That's So Dangerous. Gabriele, welcome.
Gabriele, willkommen.
Thank you. Hello.
Ich danke dir. Können wir anfangen mit
Thank
einer
you.
Analyse?
Can we start with your analysis of what's happening around us right now? So we're in the middle of these negotiations between the US and Russia, which apparently involve 28 points, or 19, whatever it is, aimed at finding a diplomatic end to the war. And the Europeans who are trying to engage, but are also upset that decisions are being made over their heads, creating facts on the continent. Could you put that into context for us a bit?
Zu schaffen auf dem Kontinent, könntest du das für uns ein bisschen einordnen?
Ja, in Europa beziehungsweise in der EU und auch in Deutschland.
Yes, in Europe, meaning in the EU and also in Germany, people are getting quite worked up, which I don't really understand because we've had almost 4 years to take action ourselves, to come up with our own peace plans. And everything that has come in the past 4 years has come from China, from Brazil, from African countries, but not from Brussels, Paris, or Berlin, or anywhere else. And now to be surprised that efforts toward peace are being made over our heads, well, that really shouldn't come as a surprise. I get the impression that many of the Europeans' actions, or inactions, depending on how you look at it, are also connected to their attempts to figure out how to get out of this situation without losing face.
Herauszufinden, wie man ohne Gesichtsverlust aus dieser Sache wieder rauskommt, denn das ist ja einigermaßen schwierig, da die Kurve zu kriegen.
Because it's quite difficult to get that curve right. What I don't understand, and I'll say it, consider irresponsible, is that these initial steps that now exist, and if Trump started them, okay, Trump is Trump, but if he started them, then there's at least one advantage, namely, that the realization is spreading that this war can only be ended through diplomatic means, not military ones. What would that even look like militarily? This loss of reality that shows up in political statements from Germany and also the EU truly leaves me speechless.
Der macht mich wirklich fassungslos.
Ich glaube, darüber müssen wir sprechen. Woher kommt
I think we need to talk about that. Where does it come from, and how is it possible that right now in European media, especially in German language media, it keeps being written that Putin must not be allowed to win, that the Russians must not get away with this, and no one writes about what is actually happening on the battlefield at the moment? The battlefield looks really bad for the Ukrainians, for the Europeans, and it can't be stopped. It's as if someone were saying, a steamroller is coming toward us, but it must not come toward us. And if it keeps coming, then I just say that shouldn't be. Where does this bizarre attitude come from?
Also ich glaube, das Problem liegt daran, dass man
Well, I think the problem is that factual analysis is repeatedly, or often, replaced by morality and ideology, which I absolutely understand. When you're in the middle of the disaster of a war, whether you're a politician traveling there or a journalist reporting on it, you're angry, outraged, and can hardly resist feelings like revenge or something similar. I find that absolutely understandable and human, and if it were otherwise, that would be terrible. But these categories must not become journalistic or political categories, because then there's no end in sight. I think one must be able, especially as a politician, since the core competence of politics is diplomacy, not war, but also as a journalist, one must be able to abstract and analyze, to identify interests.
Und wenn es so ist, dass man nur die eigenen Interessen für legitim
And if it's the case that one considers only one's own interests legitimate and dismisses all other interests as illegitimate, refuses to acknowledge them, doesn't listen, and instead creates a framework into which everything is forced to fit one's own ideology, then peaceful coexistence won't work. It's time to put everyone's interests on the table. The impression that Russia has completely prevailed after these 28 points, of which only a few remain, though no one really knows which, comes from the fact that Russia's interests were not acknowledged at all beforehand.
Liegt daran, dass man die Interessen Russlands vorher überhaupt nicht zur Kenntnis genommen hat.
Aber die Diskussion in Europa ist ja auch.
But the discussion in Europe is also interesting. People say, yes, the Russians are pushing through. They must not be allowed to prevail. These territories must not be ceded. But that has nothing to do with where the soldiers are actually standing today. The fact that Russia has been fighting this battle militarily for the past 3.5 years is simply being ignored and glossed over at the moment because of these moral notions. And even though they are absolutely justified, that one says countries must not attack each other, the prohibition of violence applies, all of that is true. It doesn't change the sheer naked fact that the soldiers are standing where they are standing.
Das ist ja genau der Punkt.
That's exactly the point. You have to keep repeating it so that no one can accuse you of denying it. Of course, the Russian attack on Ukraine was a violation of international law, absolutely clear. And of course, as a civilized person, you want those who started something like that not to get away with it. That's all correct. But if you analyze the situation soberly, what's the alternative, for heaven's sake? To get out of it, to spare the people who are standing at the front and not sitting in some warm offices, to end the suffering, to stop the dying. And that can only happen by seeking conversation, dialogue, and a balance of interests with those who currently hold the stronger position, whatever the reasons may be.
Das Gespräch und den Dialog und den Interessenausgleich sucht. Jetzt mal von der anderen Seite.
Now, looking at it from the other side, there's no point in just shifting blame back and forth. I know that too. Nevertheless, if you want to shape the future, you have to analyze and acknowledge the present as it is. And that also means knowing the past, the developments that led to the current situation. I can't even remember if it was Montesquieu or someone else. There's a saying that not only those who start a war are responsible, but also those who made it inevitable. As I said, this isn't about assigning blame, but simply about analysis, so that we can create a stable foundation for everyone involved in the future.
Für sämtliche Beteiligten hinkriegt. Wenn immer so viel davon die Rede ist, ja Sicherheitsgarantien.
Whenever there's so much talk about security guarantees and this ghost debate in the EU about European, meaning NATO, troops being supposed to guarantee security, which is hardly to be outdone in terms of detachment from reality, I would counter that if a diplomatic solution is reached that truly balances interests, then security guarantees almost become unnecessary, because no one would have any interest in changing the situation anymore. So, I find that aspect completely neglected, and coming from countries that are so proud of their state structures, rightly so, of their civilization and all that, it deeply disappoints me that they can think only in terms of victory and defeat.
There's also something about it when we try to accompany this intellectually. Something very illogical in these lines of argument, something that just doesn't add up for me. These so-called security guarantees, that Europe insists one cannot support peace in Ukraine unless there are security guarantees to ensure no new war breaks out. But we already have a war. It's already a war. How do you say it? Putting the cart before the horse. It should be the other way around. How do we end the dying in the war? And then how do we arrive at a security order that once again guarantees peace?
It's also striking how often the argument goes like this. Putin doesn't want peace. You can't talk to Putin. What's conveniently left out, however, is that on the EU side, on the German side, dialogue was also prevented. Anyone who even suggested meeting with Putin after Russia invaded Ukraine to talk with him was quickly pushed to the political sidelines. It took someone like Donald Trump to come along and break that taboo. So these are the kinds of claims being used, which are, yes, I'll say it again, find irresponsible to claim that Putin doesn't want peace.
Putin wolle keinen Frieden. Da wird auch zu wenig differenziert, was völlig klar ist.
There's also too little differentiation there. It's absolutely clear that Putin and Russia can currently take more time because, militarily speaking, they're simply in a stronger position, able to take more time than Ukraine. So he doesn't have to rush into making peace. But that has nothing to do with the fact that Russia's fundamental interest in peace is massive and real. I'm always surprised and puzzled that people fail to distinguish between those two things in their arguments. That's a classic debate that, if it's not happening in politics, should at least be taking place in the media.
What's your opinion on this ugly word in German? I have to say this here, because we'll be translating this conversation into other languages later. In other languages, it's almost impossible to convey, but in German, there's this word, Putin Versteher, a person who understands Vladimir Putin, and that's meant as an insult. It's used to accuse the other side of justifying or even approving of Russia's actions. And the fact that we've managed to turn the word understand into something negative. That's quite interesting, isn't it?
Exactly, but that fits perfectly with the general framing, as I'd call it. Being a Russia sympathizer is already bad enough, and a Putin sympathizer is an even stronger accusation. And I still refuse to go along with this semantic redefinition that makes understanding something negative. People often confuse understanding with having sympathy. Having sympathy is something else entirely. Understanding means grasping something, and the basis for making reasonable, meaningful, sustainable, and reliable decisions is quite simply that you first understand what it's all about.
But
that has really taken hold, that if you're a Putin sympathizer, that's a development I honestly wouldn't have thought possible. In my understanding of democracy, democracy thrives on debate. And as long as no one is doing anything illegal, people should be able to throw arguments at each other, vigorously but decently. The fact that this is being prevented by labeling those who hold different opinions from the current mainstream as Putin sympathizers, or disinformation or something like that, I find more than questionable.
Halte ich für mehr als grenzwertig.
Yes, and the fact that this mixing is constantly being done, understanding, explaining, justifying, it all gets thrown into the same pot. Exactly. But this phenomenon is new. I mean, we didn't have any Saddam sympathizers in 2003, nor any Gaddafi sympathizers in 2011. This phenomenon, where rationally following the other side's arguments is portrayed as something negative, that's relatively new, just in the last 4 or 5 years.
Es gibt sicher viele Gründe dafür. Ich fürchte, einer ist, dass
There are certainly many reasons for that. I'm afraid one of them is that the negative image of Russia, back then it was the Soviets, now it's the Russians, was so cemented by history, by earlier times, the evil Russians and all that. Also, ideologically speaking, communism versus democracy and so on. This enemy image, which was also deliberately maintained, wasn't dissolved by that relatively short phase under Gorbachev, when we actually had the opposite, Gorbimania, that total enthusiasm, but is so deeply ingrained that it can be revived very, very quickly. So, it just needs, well, it had already been foreshadowed. Under Gorbachev it was one thing, but it basically started again under Yeltsin. That was another very particular phase, which didn't do Russia any good either, but that would probably take us too far now.
Die Russland auch nicht gut getan hat, aber das würde jetzt wahrscheinlich zu weit führen. So, und dann kam Putin. Und wenn irgendwelche
and then came Putin. And whenever things happened in that society that we didn't immediately understand, whether it was how Russia tried to build a civil society, or how it tried to achieve something like privatization, whenever we didn't understand it because it didn't fit into our framework, that old image of hostility toward Russians quickly resurfaced. So I believe that plays a major role. and I would very much like to see more education about it, especially in schools, by the way. Because if we keep going like this, we'll end up with a very solid image of hostility toward Russians again, and that will certainly not make our future existence any easier. I'm convinced of that.
Wie erklärst du dir, dass
How do you explain that under Angela Merkel, despite all the ups and downs with Russia, Nord Stream was always something like a guiding star that Germany and Russia held onto together, and that this project, like others, eventually collapsed after she left? I mean, she was anything but a great friend of Russia, but she was a Russia pragmatist, wasn't she?
Freund, aber sie war ein Russland-Pragmatiker?
Ja, das denke ich schon. Ja. Vor allen Dingen Frau Merkel.
Yes, I think so. Above all, Mrs. Merkel did many things, how should I put it? She didn't jump at every little thing that was thrown her way, not even by the media. As for Nord Stream, which most people don't really have on their radar anymore, originally, those pipelines were actually at the core of European energy policy. It was in fact once a priority project of the EU. Just think about that. And now, if we fast forward to the present, I find it hard to explain to people why Germany wants to give up affordable Russian gas and oil in this way.
Das, was ich auch nicht verstehe, die Sprengung.
What I also don't understand, the blowing up of Nord Stream 2, how little effort was made, both politically and in the media, to pursue it, as if it weren't important or relevant at all. What really baffled me was when Chancellor Scholz visited Mr. Biden in Washington back then, and Biden basically signaled that if the Russians didn't do this or that, then Nord Stream would be history. And the German Chancellor stood next to him and said nothing, not a word. German interests played no role whatsoever. And looking at it today, I consider it a scandal that Germany still buys Russian gas, just not directly, but through detours and at many times the price. How is anyone supposed to make sense of that?
Wem will man das denn noch erklären?
Also man kann es nicht erklären, man kann es wirklich nur noch durch
Well, you can't really explain it. You can only excuse it through ideology by saying, yes, well, we had to do it to satisfy our PR department, because at this point, it's really just about ideology. That's where certain narratives come into play too. And as I just said, it's simply ideological, moral, symbolic politics.
Moralische Symbolpolitik. Man kann ja durchaus die Frage stellen, was ist denn moralischer?
One can certainly ask the question, what is actually more moral? To pragmatically focus on policies that genuinely make people's lives easier, or to adhere to moral principles and simply carry them through, theoretically, that is. Which is fine in theory, but in practice, it often doesn't work out. Quite concretely, in a democracy, I expect society to be educated and informed enough to argue and debate about the best and most practical solutions. And the problem is, what's best and what's most practical are sometimes not the same thing. But that issue isn't even brought up. Instead, everything gets categorized. Are you on the good side or the bad side?
Bist du auf der guten oder bist du auf der schlechten Seite? Und das Problem dabei, wenn man sich auf der guten
And the problem with that is, when you believe you're on the good side, well then you don't really have to argue anymore, because everything you do is for the good cause. In that case, you can even break a few rules, if necessary, because it's for the good cause. And those who find themselves on the so-called bad side have no chance at all to get their arguments, their opinions across, or to be heard. And that, I mean, in the long run, that's how you destroy democratic systems. And in my view, the danger from that is far greater than those constantly invoked external attacks that are said to threaten our democracy. Those happen too, but I think the more effective damage is what we manage to do, all by ourselves, from within.
Ganz alleine hinkriegen im Inneren.
Das ist so eine gute Überleitung. Wo siehst du denn
That's a good transition. Where do you see Germany and Europe standing today in 2025 on a larger scale? If we think about where the continent stood in 1995, 30 years ago, the expansion of Europe, the economic area, the EU, those positive memories and the euphoria that prevailed back then, the feeling that everything was going to get better, The Cold War was over, everything was improving, and haven't we now reached the opposite point? Where do you see Europe standing today?
Wo siehst du Europa stehen?
Ja, wenn wir zurückdenken an
Yes, if we think back to the late 1980s, that's exactly what happened. We all got along. The East-West conflict was over, or at least it seemed that way. And there were indeed the conditions and the offer from then Soviet President Gorbachev to build a common European house. The conditions were truly there, but nothing came of it. Many factors played a role in that. The fact that the EU expanded is, in principle, not a bad idea at all. Quite the opposite. If you imagine a well-functioning Eurasian continent, a well-functioning EU, cooperation with Russia and everything surrounding it, that would already be quite a good outlook.
Das wäre ja schon mal eine ziemlich gute Perspektive. Ein Fehler, meine Einschätzung, den man in Brüssel
A mistake, in my view, that was made in Brussels was that the newly joined members, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, were increasingly allowed to take the lead in shaping European foreign policy toward Russia. They had a lot of unresolved issues, so to speak. And for these countries, Moscow was still synonymous with the Soviet Union and painful memories of Soviet times. That's all understandable. We're once again in the realm of the human, the moral, things like that, all understandable. But to turn that into the basis for political decisions that determine the future, especially if one truly means to pursue a policy of peace, that simply doesn't work. In my view, that's a very essential point.
Für meine Begriffe ein sehr wesentlicher Punkt. Und ich denke, dass Europa, ich bin immer schon
And I think that Europe, I'm always torn about this, Europe, the EU, well, let's say the EU, Western European countries, that they, just like the USA, by the way, haven't realized that our global significance is declining. That's something we first have to get used to. That's just how it is. Let me give an example. When we report on meetings of the BRICS countries, it's not uncommon for us to say, the so-called BRICS countries are meeting. In other words, we still haven't realized that the BRICS countries are a power factor, an economic factor as well. When we stand there and say that Russia is isolated, Russia has never been isolated, not if you look at it globally. You just have to look at the BRICS countries, look at the globe, and see how many there are.
Hat sich erweitert in einer Art und Weise. Ja, man kann's ja runter.
It has expanded in a way, you can practically recite it, not only in terms of population, but also in terms of economic power. The BRICS countries, the BRICS Plus, have surpassed the G7 in economic strength. That's something we have to acknowledge. So, long story short, I believe that in Europe, in the EU countries, the realization hasn't sunk in that Europe's role is no longer what it was decades ago. We've failed to recognize that and deal with it. Sorry, but I'll just say it like that. And that's probably one of the reasons why the EU states are in a way sabotaging the peace efforts of Trump and Putin. I can only use that word again, because I think it's irresponsible.
Das Wort nur noch mal nutzen, was ich für verantwortungslos halte.
Dass diese Einsicht verschlafen wurde.
That this realization was slept through, and that it's still not being addressed. At the moment, in Europe, in the EU, but I also say Europe because I include Switzerland in that, so it's all the same cake. And what's going on is very, very similar. There's no inclination under my roof to say, maybe I should work on myself. Maybe I should try to reflect on whether I made mistakes. Or rather, whether we made mistakes. And when that does happen, especially in the public media, it's usually with the question, why didn't we deliver more weapons? Why didn't we invest more in the war? And not, how did we end up in this situation? Instead, the answer is always, because we're being attacked by Mr. Putin, and not, what went wrong? Where do you think this uncritical attitude toward the self comes from?
Woher denkst du, kommt diese unkritische Haltung mit dem Selbst?
Ich glaube, ein wesentlicher Punkt ist dieses Moral.
I think an essential point is this sense of moral superiority. Things are better for us, so we are also better. And the democratic system, everything's fine. It's the best of all the bad options, you could say. But taking that as a basis, without really acknowledging everything around it, and without being open to the realization that not everyone in the world wants to do things exactly the way we do. That shows a lack of humility, a lack of willingness to recognize realities. And simply, even if it sounds trite or cliched, just accepting conversation partners as equals and letting them speak, without that attitude of, we're better.
Attitüde, wir sind was Besseres. Das haben wir einfach drin. Ich meine, es ist, wenn man es ganz böse.
We just have that ingrained. I mean, if you put it harshly, it's still a kind of colonialist mindset. And that really needs to go. We're not better, for heaven's sake. And there are so many approaches in other countries that might actually do us some good. But for that, we'd have to accept them as conversation partners, instead of always focusing so precisely on what kind of system they have. There's a whole history behind why things are the way they are.
Das hat ja auch alles eine Geschichte, warum das so ist. Und das vielleicht auch noch anzuschließen.
And to add to that, I think it's better, in my opinion, for people living in systems that we, for good reasons, don't approve of, if they can decide for themselves how quickly they might want to change their systems, rather than having something imposed on them from the outside, like being told, first, second, third, you have to do this and that in order to engage with us economically, politically, and so on. In other words, trusting people in other countries and letting them take action themselves, because they probably know better what their society needs, so that the people living there can feel comfortable.
Nötig ist, sie so zu machen, dass die Menschen, die da leben, sich wohlfühlen.
Das Kuriose im Moment ist ja, dass Europa.
The curious thing right now is that Europe is loudly proclaiming, we want democracy. It's about democracy versus dictatorships, and the world must be democratic. At the same time, we have countries like China and Russia saying that the global community must function democratically. And by that, they mainly mean the UN, the equality of all systems among each other, and of all 193 UN member states among each other. These are actually two different concepts of democratic equality. How do you see it? Are there politicians in Germany who say we need to address this, or is it simply not understood?
Darauf müssen wir eingehen, oder wird das schlicht und ergreifend nicht verstanden?
Also mir fällt es jetzt schwer, da mit irgendwelchen Namen zu kommen.
Well, I find it hard right now to come up with any names. The expression you used, it's simply not understood. It doesn't happen. In my view, such debates should be initiated by the media if they're not being started politically. But I can't find anything like that. And that's exactly what's essential for shaping a rapidly changing world in a way that minimizes wars, ends existing ones, and ensures people's economic well-being. There are so many imbalances. Or take the climate, take all those issues. It just doesn't work on its own anymore. I would wish for these debates to at least be initiated by the media, if they're not happening in politics, because that's the foundation for everything.
Politik nicht stattfinden, weil das ist ja die Basis dafür. Es gibt so viele weltweite Probleme, Klima.
There are so many global problems, climate, hunger, all these things. You can't solve them alone. They can only be solved through cooperation. And they can really only be approached with the basic idea that Gorbachev pursued in a way that very few people still have in mind today. He had a global perspective. He didn't just talk about the European house. He also wrote a lot about how we should orient ourselves globally toward the things that matter to people. Not just for survival, but for living well. And I think at some point we have to make that leap. And in the countries that have done the best so far, that realization is probably hard to establish. We simply haven't needed it until now. Everything was going fine.
So in this case, it's also a matter of habit, isn't it? Europe's habit, not just over the last 100 years, but over the last 500 years, of sitting at the top, sitting there as if it's the most natural thing in the world, and from there telling everyone else how things are done. And somehow we can't seem to break out of that habit.
That's the
hubris, that Eurocentric perspective. And it's time for it to be replaced by a realistic view of things, reflecting how the world actually looks today. It's no longer like it was in the last century, and that has to be accepted. You can regret it, for heaven's sake, but you have to accept it if you want to find a practical and good way to shape life for yourself and for others.
Wie kommt es deiner Ansicht nach, dass wir jetzt seit
In your view,
Jahren
how is it that we've had this transatlantic pact, the NATO, for 70, almost 80 years now, and that we've essentially merged North America and Western Europe? Yet we've actually never had, at least I can't recall ever having, a transcontinentalism. We've never had peace, harmony, and happiness from Vladivostok all the way to Portugal. But right now, we have great peace. Not just peace, but an integration of Europe and North America. How did that come about?
Wie kommt das?
Gut, dass du hier Vladivostok und Lissabon und sowas angesprochen hast.
It's good that you brought up Vladivostok and Lisbon and so on. Those proposals didn't come from any Western capitals, but from Moscow, from Vladivostok to Lisbon, a common economic area, and a shared security architecture from Vladivostok to Vancouver and so on. So if you think back to the founding of NATO, for example, it was established as a defense alliance, back then in the East-West conflict during the Cold War. At that time, it did indeed have a certain justification, you could say. Then there was NATO's counterpart, the Warsaw Pact, the Warsaw Treaty. And if you think back to the time when the Warsaw Pact was dissolved and only NATO remained from that original structure, it would have made sense for NATO to restructure itself to adapt to the new security situation. Because defense alliance against whom exactly? Back then, the global political situation was completely different. But it didn't do that, even though there were corresponding considerations. Instead, it expanded eastward, which, as was originally stated, was not supposed to happen if a unified Germany became a member of NATO, and all those things. Leaving that structure as it was is, in my view, one of the reasons why we are in the situation we are in today.
Mit ein Grund, warum wir in der Situation sind, in der wir jetzt sind. Denn die NATO musste sich ja irgendwas einfallen lassen,
because NATO had to come up with something to justify its existence. So they started with these out-of-area missions. In my view, the beginning of the end. Failing to realize that the largest country in the world, Russia, is one of the few that could, if necessary, get by on its own, and failing to include that country in some kind of security architecture, that, in my opinion, is a key reason for the catastrophic situation we're in now. Let me tell a little story. At the end of the 1980s, when we were all euphoric, the East-West conflict was over, the Cold War was over. A head of state said to me, in a personal conversation, "We will one day long for these manageable times again."
Wir werden uns noch nach diesen überschaubaren Zeiten zurücksehnen. Und ich war ziemlich sauer und habe gedacht, dass...
And I was pretty angry and thought, what a spoilsport. What is he talking about? Because I couldn't imagine that anyone would long for those times again. The balance of terror and all that. It took me quite a while to understand what he meant, that regional conflicts would be the challenges of the future. And NATO wasn't designed for regional conflicts. It was overwhelmed by them. And that's exactly how it turned out. The armed conflicts haven't decreased. They've actually increased. And in those regional conflicts, NATO either got involved or failed to have a stabilizing effect. I would like to see these things debated so that we can draw conclusions for the future. But as far as I can tell, that isn't happening.
Würde ich mir wünschen, findet aber, so wie ich das sehe, nicht statt.
Interpretierst du diesen Vorgang ein?
Do you interpret this process as an example of an institutional self-runner? That NATO, so to speak, kept pushing forward out of its own internal logic? Or as an alternative interpretation, that NATO was actually always a vehicle of Washington's to exert structural influence over Europe, and that this influence simply got out of hand?
Auf Europa auszuüben und dass der dann einfach Überhand genommen hat.
Ja, in gewisser Weise schon. Und ich glaube, dass es zu unterschiedlichen
Yes, in a way, yes. And I believe that at different times, it has been stronger or weaker when it comes to American influence. It's no secret that for about 100 years, official US documents have stated that the only thing that could threaten the United States' dominance would be a functioning Eurasian continent. And against that backdrop, of course, many political decisions have been made. I think it's perfectly fair to point that out without being accused of anti-Americanism or anything like that. That's what I would like to see, both in the media and in politics, that people clearly identify interests, state them openly, and then try to find where there's common ground or not. And if there isn't, then one has to try to find compromises. In my view, that's the meaning and purpose of democratic systems. But unfortunately, that's not how it works.
Aber so läuft es ja leider nicht.
Nein, tut's nicht. Drum, es stellt sich ja die Frage dann
No,
wieder an uns,
it doesn't. The question that always comes up for us, students of international relations, is how is it that we can't get out of this? How is it that we keep ending up in these damn conflicts? One important school of thought in international relations, especially from the US, is realism. And right now, realism is in a deep crisis, because even the greatest thinkers of realism keep having to admit, this doesn't make sense anymore. It's counterintuitive, which basically means that it doesn't work the way people imagine national interest representation by states to work. Have you made any observations in that regard?
Wenn ich da eine Antwort hätte, dann würde ich versuchen, die
If I had an answer to that, I'd try to spread it as widely as possible. Sometimes I also, well, how should I put it? I'm not someone who gives up, like saying, it's all pointless anyway, even though there are situations where you do think, my God, where do you even start back at square one? Let me turn it around. If we assume that democratic systems are desirable, then we have to accept that they can only function if there are responsible, informed citizens. That means we have to do everything we can to ensure that citizens are capable of that. Essentially, that comes down to two things.
Das sind zwei Dinge im Wesentlichen. Man muss viel in die Bildung stecken. Also die müssen.
We have to invest a lot in education. They need to experience education, be thoroughly informed, and also gain an understanding of what civil courage means. Those are things, I think, where something can be done. When people then say, there's nothing I can do, there's nothing I can do, that's the death of democratic systems. Silent majorities have triggered terrible things in history more than once. And there's a wonderful thought from Arthur Schopenhauer, who said that each of us is not only responsible for what we do, but also for what we silently accept. And I think that should be discussed in every classroom.
Und das, finde ich, sollte in jedem Klassenzimmer stehen.
Es gibt auch einen Ausspruch der Hannah.
There's also a saying that's attributed to Hannah Arendt. Though she didn't say it exactly that way, she did use those words. There is no right to obey. For anyone who has studied Kant, let's leave aside for now what she actually meant by it. But, sorry, I just want to come back to this topic of how we understand this situation. One of the most interesting interpretations I've come across in my conversations is that Europe might simply be at a point where certain elites within the state have already gone beyond the state itself and owe more to each other and to the United States than to their own country. And so they no longer see their duty as being directly to the national Germany or the national France, but to the greater whole. Do you think it's possible that we actually have a problem in that we've already begun to transcend the state in our thinking?
Gedanklich schon zu übersteigen.
Da müsste ich intensiver drüber nachdenken, dazu substanziell etwas zu sagen.
I'd have to think about that more deeply to say something substantial. And I've learned in my job, I try to only talk about things I actually understand. But it's an interesting thought, and it'll make me dig into it a bit more. Another issue is that we should also think about how democratic democracies actually still are. Or also the question, I don't have a solution, but the question of how democratic the EU or the European Parliament really is. It's anything but democratic. I also don't know how it could be done differently. But the point is to keep these things in mind, and on that basis, to debate where the best solutions lie, so that we don't offer false justifications that have no real foundation, neither intellectual nor practical.
Also keine intellektuelle Basis oder auch keine praktische. Das sind so Dinge, ich glaube, solche.
These are the kinds of things. I think we can't avoid such discussions if we want to save anything. Because, as is the case in Germany, the level of credibility, both regarding the media and politics, is extremely low. And of course, you need that credibility if a democratic system is to function. If no one believes anything anymore, or doesn't trust democratic institutions, well, good grief, then all it takes is someone who's, what do you call it, a Pied Piper. And then, a lot of what was painstakingly built up goes down the drain. And we don't need any external influence for that. It works perfectly from within.
Das geht perfekt mit von innen heraus.
Wir sind uns darüber einig, dass der größte
We agree that the greatest danger of a collapse of our democracies in Europe does not come from the East, but from the ideology we are currently getting carried away with. The fact that we no longer even have debates anymore. That's what's interesting. The Americans are having a debate about what freedom of speech is, what one is allowed to say, what can be blocked and what cannot. And it seems to me that in Europe, this is essentially being regulated through EU regulations.
eigentlich quasi geregelt, Punkt.
Ja, man muss sich ja nur mal den Digital Services Act angucken.
Yes, you only have to take a look at the Digital Services Act. It's absolutely clear. It's a balancing act for a democracy to protect the system from those who want to undermine it, sometimes even using democratic means. I understand that. It's a real danger, and we have to find a way to deal with it. But then we should at least make an effort to define more precisely what that actually means. If the term disinformation appears somewhere and is even tied to severe penalties, but is never clearly defined anywhere, that opens the door wide to arbitrary state action, and that no longer has anything to do with protecting democracy. It may be sold as such, but in the worst case, it only serves to preserve the power of certain political forces. These are, in my view, the kinds of debates that need to take place, to stabilize such a system, to include everyone, and not to exclude or almost criminalize certain unwelcome opinions from the outset. That has no place in a democratic system.
Das hat in einem demokratischen System nichts zu suchen.
Absolut einverstanden. Wo siehst du
Absolutely agree. Where do you actually see the greatest chances that we might be able to return to such debates? On the one hand, we currently see that in the mainstream media, voices like yours, like Patrick Barb's and also Ulrike Garreau's, are consistently excluded and left out, even though your voices used to be in demand there. Those used to be sought-after analyses, and now they're practically banned. On the other hand, we see on social media, here on YouTube and elsewhere, a flourishing culture of debate, I'd say. Maybe not debate in the sense of an argument, but debate in the sense of presenting alternative ideas. So there's at least some reason for hope. On the other hand, the Digital Services Act could put an end to that at any time. How do you see it?
Wie siehst du's?
Einfach weitermachen. Also ich für meine Begriffe.
Just keep going.
Erstens habe ich den Eindruck, dass
Well, as far as I'm concerned, first, I have the impression that things are changing a bit, that I actually do give interviews to some newspapers now, that I'm being asked. For a long time, that was really cut off. That's true. But I have the feeling that something is happening, that there's a growing desire across the board to argue decently, in both senses of the word. That's still a bit lacking. And personally, since I'm a product of public broadcasting, I also think it plays an important role when it fulfills its mission. And I would like to add, while we're at it, that I hope the reform of public broadcasting succeeds in such a way that those who want to abolish it altogether don't gain the upper hand.
Oberwasser bekommen, die ihn von vornherein abschaffen wollen. Weil ich glaube schon, nach meinem Verständnis, dass
Because I believe, at least as I understand it, that a public broadcasting service, by its legal mandate, plays, must play, and can play a very important role in a democratic system. Because it is, in principle, not subject to any externally controlled or vested interests, but it actually has to live up to that. I can only repeat myself here. That's the foundation. People need to be informed, not bombarded with narratives, but truly informed and given the full range of information that can be made available.
von Informationen bekommen, die man kriegen kann. Und müssen sich auch
And one must also, this is one of my guiding principles for my journalistic work, be willing to embrace a change of perspective. You always have to put yourself in the other person's position. You don't have to approve of it, but you have to understand why the other person acts the way they do. So the two concepts of changing perspective and having a panoramic view are, for me, the fundamental concepts one needs to master when working as a journalist. And then you can start to observe.
Wenn man journalistisch arbeitet. Und dann kann man gucken.
Vielleicht ein letztes Themengebiet.
Maybe one last topic. If we're being optimistic and assume that the war in Ukraine could be brought to an end in the coming months, that we might actually have a peace settlement again, what do you think Russia's attitude toward Europe and toward Germany will be? In my view, we've squandered a lot with Russia in Europe over the past 30 years. Do you think we can repair any of that, and that Russia would even allow such a repair if it were being considered?
Eine Reparatur zulassen würde, wenn sie denn angedacht werden würde.
Ich gehöre ja grundsätzlich zu den Optimisten. Es gibt ja auch diesen schönen Begriff.
I generally count myself among the optimists. There's that nice saying, optimists know how bad the world can be, but pessimists come to the same realization every morning. So I try to be optimistic. Although, when you think about how generously people in the Soviet Union forgave the Germans after World War II, and you only have to mention the numbers, 27 million dead, that was an enormous achievement. And the fact that it's now Germans, of all people, who owe German reunification in large part to the Soviet Union, to Moscow, who are now becoming the leading voices of those saying that Russia has always been our enemy and will always remain our enemy, that tears me apart, I have to be honest. Because I can't find words for that. Such historical amnesia is beyond my comprehension.
Geschichtsvergessenheit ist mir unbegreiflich. Also, auf Ihre Frage zu antworten, ich hoffe.
So, to answer your question, I hope there are people of substance, on both sides, who can manage to fix this again in the foreseeable future. From where I stand now, I wouldn't know which individuals to point to. But perhaps those currently in charge should see it as an obligation to work on this intensively for the younger generation. We have to try to rebuild trust. Because Egon Bahr, one of the architects of the new German Ostpolitik in the late 1960s and early 1970s, once put it perfectly. He said, "We can change all sorts of things politically, but not geography. We will always have to deal with Russia. Security in the western part of Europe without Russia is an illusion, and against Russia, it's sheer nonsense."
Ist eine Illusion und gegen Russland ist nur vollkommener Unsinn.
Das ist etwas vom Faszinierendsten für mich.
That's one of the most fascinating things to me, that there are actually people who feel you need as many weapons as possible to keep the other side away, but can't imagine that you could simply choose not to make the other side an enemy. The best security guarantee is when you have no enemies. Germany and France have learned that. Today, no German fears that France will attack, and no French person fears Germany. Friendship is the best security strategy there is. And the fact that people don't realize that is pretty fascinating, isn't it?
Wir waren ja Erbfeinde.
We used to be hereditary enemies, France and Germany. So actually it works, if one wants it to, and makes the right intelligent decisions.
Entscheidungen trifft.
It can work, but you just have to make it happen. Georgelle, the people who want to follow you, where should they go? Where can they read your texts and subscribe to your interviews? You also have a YouTube channel.
Ja, genau. YouTube-Kanal und ich habe
Yes, exactly. YouTube channel. And I also have my page, my homepage, just my name. And yes, I'm still thinking about whether I should do something regularly, but I'm not there yet.
But in any case, folks, subscribe to Dr. Gabriele Krone-Schmalz's YouTube channel and check out her website as well. She's written wonderful books, and when something new comes up, we'll just do another update. Thank you very much. Thanks to you. Bye.
Danke dir. Tschüss.